Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the even more mildly changed Dale. I'll just get all their units out for the showcase and then we'll have a look at their stats and how they stack up to what they used to be. Dale have enough units where I can't actually fit all of them in the roster, so we're going to divide them up into foot infantry, cavalry and skirmish infantry. So let's start the deployment. And we'll spread them out nice and thin. You can get a good look at them. Now then, starting at this end, Dale have not been changed a great deal. They only have one all-new unit, and it is a foot infantry unit, so we'll be seeing them pretty soon. But the mechanics of how Dale work have changed pretty significantly, and I would say they haven't been nerfed, but neither have they been significantly buffed. So I think that Arnor and Gondor have kind of left them behind in how good the faction is overall. Nonetheless, Dale is still better value for money than those two factions. A lot of their units are much cheaper than you'll find in Arnor and Gondor, and they aren't that much worse, honestly. But I would say that the Archer nerf in particular has meant that Dale have kind of remained more static, whereas Arnor and Gondor have really moved up in the world. So starting off with the Dalesmen. The Dalesmen are a very low, well, not very low tier, but they are a low tier shock infantry. They have 4 attack, 7 defense, and 3 charge. They cost 250 each, which is very, very cheap actually for this kind of unit. Their defense is a bit low, however, for this submod, so that is why they are so cheap, really. You can have 4, of course, before the cost increases. Really, you can have 4 unless, well, 4 until the cost increases, unless I say otherwise, because there are very, very few units for which that isn't the case in this submod, really. And they have the standard shock infantry bonuses against cav and armor. They are bad versus missiles, however, as you can probably tell by their very light armor. There is another interesting bonus which is pretty heavily present in Dale, though, and they have a combat bonus in woods. And ordinarily, on a unit-by-unit basis, this isn't a huge deal. But because it's so prevalent in Dale, it actually can stack up to be a pretty significant bonus if you're playing on a map like Mirkwood. Moving on then to the Rovanian Spearmen. These are, I think, the lowest tier unit that you will have access to as Dale. They have only 1 attack, 7 defense, and 2 charge, which is pretty woeful all around. They cost 260 each, which is, you know, kind of expensive really for what they are. Why would you not get the Dalesmen? Because usually you'll get Spearmen to ward off cav, and yes, these guys can ward off cav, but 1 charge really, and you will suffer an enormous amount of losses because of how fragile they are, and they cannot form Skiltron even, which is pretty disappointing. They do have the combat bonus in woods, but ultimately I would say this is a unit you're never really going to be using. It's just in your roster. In campaign you might early on, but in multiplayer it's not going to happen really. They just don't have the effectiveness. The Bjornings. The Bjornings are a unit which is shared across a few factions. They have 10 attack, 8 defense, and 5 charge. These are actually pretty damn good numbers across the board. They don't have a lot of defense, but they can inflict a lot of damage. They will do what Bjornings do, in that, you know, you might see bears on the battlefield. I've never seen Bjornings turn into bears in my experience. They've always either routed or the battle has finished before they turn into bears. 480 per unit is not too bad for what they offer. There's a lot of damage for the price. 4, of course, before the price increases. They are good versus cav and armor, like all shock infantry with axes are. They have the bonus in woods. They're bad versus missiles, of course. They do, however, have one thing over the Dalesmen, and that is they cause fear amongst the enemy, which is always nice. It's kind of like Isengard's Berserkers, but yeah, the Bjornings are a very good unit, I find, to pad out your army. They're a surprisingly effective unit. They weren't really, I didn't really use them a lot in vanilla because there was no reason to, but now I think they're a much more useful unit. Moving on then to a unit which was used pretty heavily in vanilla if you were playing as Dale, the Dale Swordsman. It's their basic sword and shield infantry, and sword and shield infantry is, I think, even better in this submod than it was because of how tough they are to kill. And the Dale Swordsmen are no exception. 4 attack, 16 defense, and 3 charge. So for a sword and shield unit, they will hold the line very, very well for a remarkably cheap price as well. 360 per unit. And they also get the combat bonus in woods. That's a lot of good stats and a lot of nice things to have in a unit that is so cheap. Perhaps, though, you will just be investing in your higher tier units, but if you needed to save money somewhere, this is probably the best place in your entire army to do it, because they will hold the line very, very well, and, they'll, very good value for money, and I do like my units that are good value for money. Now for the half Watchmen. These are really the first spear unit for Dale that you can take seriously. 2 attack, 8 defense, and 2 charge is honestly not brilliant. 320 per unit is pretty cheap still though, but the fact that you can form Skilltron means that in a defensive siege, they may actually find some use. They're good versus Cav, of course, and have the bonus in woods, like every Dale spear, really. But the fact that you can form Skilltron is what separates these guys from the Ravanian spears that we saw earlier, but even so, they're not a brilliant unit, but in a defensive siege, they are potentially useful. And now for the spear unit, which Dale are more well known for, the Ravanian Dwarves. Now this is much more like it in terms of stats. They have 4 attack, 18 defense, and 4 charge. Of course, the 18 defense is what we're really looking for here when it comes to spears. 575 per unit is a significant step up from the other spears, but it really is worth it. They can form Skilltron as well, good versus Cav, good in woods. The difference is here though, they're well armoured, which is always nice. Nice to know you've got some sort of missile resistance, nice to know you're just a little bit tankier in the melee fight. And now we come to Dale's only all-new unit, and that is Dwarves of the Oakenshield. Nice to have a Dwarven unit here. They have good stats, 5 attack, 17 defense, and 5 charge. They're essentially a more attack-minded version of the Droughts. They cost 550 each, which is slightly less. They, however, can form Shield Wall. Very nice formation in a defensive siege. Pretty decent in a field battle as well, if you need to sort of hold the line. But it's nice to have dwarves nearby. They will also encourage the general unit if they're nearby, which is kind of an interesting bonus ability. They are, of course, good versus armor because they have axes. They're not good versus cavalry, however, because they're not two-handed axes. And they're well armored as well, just like pretty much every dwarven unit you come across. They're going to be well armored. These guys, no exception to that. Moving on to a unit which perhaps has received one of the most significant buffs in Dale's army, and that is the Dale Swordsmasters. 12 attack, 17 defense, and 7 charge. Those are pretty terrific stats all across the board. 575 each is the same as the Droughts. They cannot form a formation, of course. They're good versus Cav in a sustained melee, and they're well armored. They don't have a bonus against armor, which is a bit unfortunate, but other than that, a fantastic unit. The problem these guys had in vanilla was that they tended to die off a bit too quickly for my liking, whereas now, with the submod's buff to survivability across the board, these guys have really come into their own. And I find these guys exceptionally useful now as Dale. Perhaps the most significant positive change they've had, in addition to the addition of these dwarves over here. So 2 very nice units indeed now for Dale. We also have the Earls. Now, the Earls are a unit which have seen a change in one area in particular. This isn't in the way they behave on the battlefield, however. 7 attack, 25 defense, and 4 charge. Easily the most survivable infantry unit you have. They cost 800 each. They're very well armoured. The most significant change, however, in vanilla you can only have 1 before the price increased dramatically. Now you can have 4. Which suddenly means that Dale are an infantry faction to be feared. Which is nice because, I think the Archer nerf, if they just left it at that, Dale would have been a pretty underpowered faction, honestly. However, now their infantry with their Earls, their Swordsmasters, their Dwarves, and the next unit we'll look at, they have some real muscle on foot. And moving on to the last infantry unit, we have, of course, the Barding Herd. Very, very nice pike unit. They are technically a halberd unit, though. They can form Spear Wall, of course, which all two-handed spear units can, at least. In this mod, I believe that is the case. I might be wrong. I just know that the Orc Halberdiers have been changed so that they can now. Stats on these guys, though. 10 attack, 20 defense, and 6 charge. They have more stats than the pike unit, of course, because they're a halberd unit. Very, very nice unit to use. As good as ever. They're good versus armor because of their sort of axe-like halberds here. And they're very well armoured themselves, so a very, very tough unit to break down, both in a field battle and in a siege of all descriptions. I can't think of a Dale army I would build that did not include the Barding Herd, one of the most significant pillars in a Dale army. Anyway, now I will just set up for the archers, and I think I'll include the archers and the cavalry in one go. Okay, so starting off in an area where Dale are still very, very strong in their archers. The archers may have taken a nerf across the board, and that may have somewhat affected how Dale play, but nonetheless, Dale's archer contingent is still exceptionally strong. We'll start off with the Woodsman, which is their lowest tier archer unit. Now, the melee stats aren't terribly important, but attack of 3, defense of 4, and charge of 1 is bad. 320 cost each is very cheap, of course, because they are a low tier unit. They only have 3 missile score, however. That's not terrific. They do have a bonus in woods, like a lot of Dale units have. Again, though, archers in woods, it can be a bit ropey. They're also bad against enemy missiles because of how low their armor is. I can't really think of a situation where you'd use these unless you were very, very low on money indeed. But other than that, they may be a very good low-tier archer unit, because a lot of low-tier archers tend to be even worse than this, but even so, I would say you probably are going to be steering clear of this. Moving on to this unit here, which is a Bardian Marksman unit. Now, Dale have got 2 Bardian Marksman units, and this one is the smaller one because it is the general version. Dale's General's Bodyguard is intended to be an archer unit, which is interesting, very similar to the Elves. They have 7 attack, 20 defense, and 4 charge. That's very good stats in melee. There are only 45 of them though, and remember that they are archers, so it's going to be interesting. These guys have also got very good accuracy, it must be said, as most General's Bodyguard units will. 540 per unit. Generally, you will probably only have 1 to house your general though. Missile score of 7 is the highest of all the archer units, of all the composite bow units anyway. Dale do have some other types of missile units which are slightly more damaging. Nonetheless, the best archer unit they have in terms of damage. They have a combat bonus in woods. They're also well armoured. So a very, very individually deadly archer unit. Perhaps there's a case for saying they don't get enough arrows downrange, but nonetheless, very good General's Bodyguard unit in my opinion. Moving on now to the Longbowmen. Now these guys were always the best lower tier archer unit in my opinion, and that hasn't changed in this mod. 3, 4, and 1 are not very good melee stats, it must be said. 575 each is also relatively expensive for what they offer, but they have 5 missile damage, and 5 missile damage may not sound like a lot, but it's kind of middle of the road for this mod, and they're honestly not a very high tier unit, so you're getting a lot of missile damage for a relatively low price. They can also deploy stakes now, which is always nice. They have the combat bonus in woods. They are bad against enemy archers though. Not the most heavily armoured lads, these guys. Now moving on to the Athan Rangers. Now the Athan Rangers were always pretty expensive, and that hasn't changed. They cost 800 each, although you can have 4 now before the price increases, which is always nice with some of these higher tier units. Stats in melee, 5 attack, 12 defense, and 3 charge. That's not bad defense, but there isn't a lot of them, and you really want them to be shooting their arrows rather than being in the melee if at all possible. A missile score of 6 is also pretty good. So you're getting a decent amount of arrow damage for this submod in this arch unit. So still one of my personal favourites. Maybe not as good anymore as the Dunedain Rangers are, but we'll get onto that another time. You can still deploy their stakes, of course. And now for the regular Bardian Marksman unit, one of my favourite archer units in vanilla, has taken a pretty significant nerf unfortunately, because of course the missile score is now only 6. Nonetheless, they are still one of the better archer units in the game. 5 attacks, 17 defense, and 3 charge means they are a very nice makeshift infantry unit when they run out of ammunition still. They can deploy stakes now, which is an improvement, but the significant nerf to missile damage is still a bit of a problem. They have the combat bonus in woods too. They're also well armoured as well, so that's always nice. Moving on now past the composite bows where Dale are still strong to the javelins. They did have Rivermen, of course, in vanilla. The Rivermen in melee, their stats are still poor. 2, 8, and 1 is bad. 350 is cheap though. They have the combat bonus in woods, and 350 is cheap because of the amount of missile damage they can get downrange. They can get 11 damage downrange. Now, of course, these guys can be picked apart by enemy archers very easily because of the range. They do have shields, however, so they're not terrible against archers. They don't have any vulnerable to missiles trait, but nonetheless, they're still going to take a great deal of punishment from them if you're not careful. But these are now a viable unit for Dale, whereas before they honestly kind of weren't, because Dale's skirmishers were so good there was no excuse for not bringing them. But now potentially there is a reason to bring them. Then there are these guys, the Ravanian Hunters. Now, I don't really understand what the point of these guys is, honestly, because the Rivermen deal more damage. The Rivermen are also better in melee. The stats on these guys are 1, 7, and 1. These guys are more expensive. You can only have 3 before the price increases. They deal less damage per missile as well. Their missile strength is only 9. And they throw and then they charge. And honestly, I've never been the biggest fan of that. I would rather they expend all their ammunition and then charge in. And honestly, these guys aren't good enough in melee for me to want them to charge in. So I'm kind of struggling to see the point of these guys other than in campaign. Single player. Anyway, not really a unit you're going to be seeing. If you're going to use a Javelin unit, use the Rivermen. Moving on to Dale's Cav contingent. This was always a pretty good part of their army in vanilla. That hasn't changed either. The Yeomen are actually a pretty remarkably good low-tier Cav unit. Their stats are 5 attack, 8 defense, and 9 charge. Now the 9 charge is very good for their cost, which is only 480. They have no other significant bonuses, however. They're not the most heavily armoured. They will start to drop pretty significantly in a sustained melee, even more rapidly than most Cav will. Nonetheless, this is honestly not a bad Cav unit at all. Not a bad low-tier Cav unit. Other than Dale's very best Cav, I would honestly say that this is the best one you can bring. Moving on to, in my opinion, Dale's worst Cav unit, and that is the Ravanian Riders. The Ravanian Riders are in melee 2, 10, and 6. That's not the best stats. 420 as well. You know, it is cheaper than the Yeoman, but honestly the charge is too low to make them worth it. Like, they're not even that survivable in melee, honestly. 10 defense is not bad, but it's not terrific either. The Dale Calves is a returning unit, and honestly they too suffer from a fairly low charge, only 8. They do have more defense and more attack, so they are more viable, but they are more expensive as well than the Yeoman at 525. Next up we have, in my opinion, Dale's new best Cav unit, the Aethwodia Horse Guards. I always thought that these guys were too fragile in vanilla, but now they are certainly not. 7 attack, 20 defense, and 12 charge. They're a pretty devastating Cav unit. 960 each is not cheap, but it's also cheaper than some of the higher tier factions, it must be said. And they're also very well armoured, so they will stand up to archer fire. Archers are not going to be able to stop them from getting that devastating charge off. Very good unit indeed. Got to buff this one, and it's to Dale's benefit. Finally, the Earls. They honestly haven't changed a great deal. They're still very poor on the charge. They only have 5, which honestly in this mod is even worse, but they have gotten even more survivable. 10 attack and 22 defense, which means in a sustained melee this Cav unit is very, very strong indeed. Although it's not enough of an improvement to make up for their lack of a charge, especially next to the Aethwodia. They are very well armoured, but as I said, this is only going to be something you're going to use to house your general, and other than that, bring Aethwodia, because they're just better now. So yeah, that's Dale. Interesting faction. They've taken the Archer nerf, but I think that their buffs in other areas basically mean they've remained exactly the same in terms of power. However, Gondor and Arnor have moved up in terms of power, so I think that Dale are now worse than them, but they're still a very good faction. Still a favourite of mine, Dale. Anyway, next up we'll be going back to one of the evil factions. I don't really know which one yet, but I'll figure it out, and I hope to see you then.